Go. Yeah, it's chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5. And chapter 5 of Pirkei Avos is the chapter of Numbers. So we may not get to actually start the first Mishnah today, because we actually need to do an introduction about numbers. And it sounds like an interesting topic, right? Numbers, I don't know. Some people could say, I'm not an accountant, I didn't sign up for this. What's exciting or interesting about numbers? So if you have a look at this chapter, this is the chapter that speaks first about a whole series of things that are associated with the number 10. Like, for example, the world was created with 10 utterances, the 10 generations between Adam and Noach, between Noach and Abraham, the 10 different miracles that happen in the Beis Hamikdash, etc. Okay, so there are a whole lot of 10s. Then we have a whole lot of 7s. So a few missions that are dedicated to number 7. And then we have a whole lot of numbers 4. Okay? So there's missions about 10, missions about 7, and missions about 4. So there are two questions we have to address right at the beginning before we get into the chapter. Question number 1 is, why those numbers? What's the symbolism and significance of those numbers? But before that, if you were writing a Jewish book, and the Jewish book was about the significance of the number 10, what's the first 10 that you would have listed? 10 commandments, right? And it's not there. The 10 commandments are not part of this conversation. So that's the first question. Before we get into the significance of the 3 types of numbers that the Mishnah focuses on, why not the Aseres HaDibros? Why not the 10 commandments? Surely, this is a book of Torah. Surely that is the most significant number 10 that you could possibly think of. Instead, what do we begin with? Ba'asara ma'amoros nivra ha'olam, that the world was created with 10 utterances. Now, the fact is, we could have even done that. We could have started with the 10 utterances, because that's maybe the context of our world, and that's where we live. At least after that, we should have said, and there are 10 commandments. We should have, right? We should have put it in. How do we go through a chapter that speaks about the significance of number 10 and leave that one out? It's fascinating. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but right at the beginning of the inauguration of the Mishkan, when the Jewish people were in the desert, so it talks about the various offerings that each leader of each shevet, each tribe brought. And one of the things that it says over there is, it says, Asara hakaf b'shekel hakodesh. Now, effectively, what that is, it's just a measurement. It's a measurement of part of what was the contribution that they brought in the Mishkan. So it was 10, and 10 is what each kaf, a kaf is this almost elongated ladle that they used to use to bring various components of the offerings in the base, then in the Mishkan, subsequently in the Beis Hamikdash. So it's telling us how much it held. Asara akaf b'shekel hakodesh, or it was the value of 10 pieces of silver, and that gave you a sense of the size and, of course, the volume of what it could hold. So in Kabbalah it says this: Asara, there are 2 things that are represented by the number 10. Hakaf, a kaf is also the kaf moznayim. It's relevant at this time of year. We're coming up to Rosh Hashanah. Kaf moznayim means the part of a scale that you actually put the item in that you're planning to weigh. So the dish or the holder that you'd put the item in is called the kaf. So asara hakaf b'shekel hakodesh. The 2 words asara, the 2 10s. There are 2 10s that are balanced in holiness. One is Asara Ma'amoros, which we're reading about in this chapter, the 10 utterances that Hashem used to create the world. And the other is Aseres HaDibros, the 10 commandments, which are there to give meaning to the world. So you only have the balance when you have the 2 of them working in collaboration. If you only have the Asara Ma'amoros, you only speak about and only focus on the creation of the world, you miss the purpose. If you only have the purpose in a spiritual sense, and you don't have the world, you don't have application for the purpose. So they have to work in tandem. Asara hakaf b'shekel hakodesh. You have to have both the 10 utterances and the 10 commandments. So actually, if we are going to be quite clear about this and quite pedantic about it, we actually don't call them the 10 commandments in Judaism. What do we call them? Aseres HaDibros. What's a dibra? It's also a statement, right? So the 10 statements, ma'amoros, one kind, one style of statement, which creates. And then there's Aseres HaDibros, another set of 10 different statements that effectively direct and inform what the purpose of creation is. So that's interesting in its own right. So how could it be that we are here learning about significant things in the whole history of the world and the makeup of society and the makeup of the universe that are associated with the number 10, and we leave out Aseres HaDibros? We leave out the 10 Commandments. So there are two answers that are suggested. Both of them obviously are relevant. One is easier to understand than the other. So if you remember right at the beginning when we began Pirkei Avos, so we quoted the Gemara in Bava Kama that says that if a person wants to learn how to be a chassid, in other words, somebody who lives beyond the requirements of halacha, beyond the requirements of the law, then what they should learn is Pirkei Avos. And from that we get the expression that Pirkei Avos is called Mili de Chasidusa. It's the part of Torah that tells us about that which is beyond the letter of the law. So that's one argument in favor of why Aseres HaDibros are not mentioned in Pirkei Avos, because Aseres HaDibros, the 10 Commandments, are the letter of the law. And the purpose of Pirkei Avos is to teach us Mili de Chasidusa, how to live beyond the letter of the law. And so therefore we don't bring it into this conversation. I don't know if you do or don't find that to be a satisfactory answer, but it is one of the answers that are given. The other answer is fascinating. And they're both valid, obviously, but the other answer is absolutely fascinating. What is Torah? If we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments, yes?
The blueprint of the world.
Now you see, you've got to be so careful when you say something like that. It's the blueprint of creation, yes? We know that. There's the famous Midrash that says that what did Hashem do in order to create the world? Like an architect who consults the blueprints, or at least the architect creates the blueprints. The builder has to consult the blueprints, and based on that can actually build the construction. So in the same way, Hashem made the Torah as the blueprint for the world, and you look into the Torah, Stakel Bo'araisa, Hashem looked into the Torah, Ubora Alma, and that's how he created the world. So blueprint of the world, yes? Are the 10 Commandments the blueprint of the world?
Have to be.
Don't have to be.
No.
Are the 10 Commandments the blueprint of the world?
Because there's more.
There's mitzvahs, right? What's the purpose of mitzvahs?
To
To connect us
to Hashem.
to Hashem. Yes? Okay. Now, that's all fine and good. That's all fine and good. But is that what Torah is? You see, this is what happens to us often, is we have a particular insight, and we have to remember that the Torah is very layered. So when we learn a particular insight, that doesn't mean we've got the entire picture. They're layers. There's more to the story than what we learn in that particular source. And remember that each source is valid. It's just a question of how deep it's taking us. So have you ever heard the expression of Chazal? Alpayim shana kodma Torah la'olam. Have you ever heard this expression? The Torah preceded the world by 2,000 years. The Torah preceded the world by 2,000 years. And that's... It's not a pasuk, it's a Maimer Chazal, statement from the Chazal. Alpayim shana, 2,000 years. Kadma Torah, the Torah preceded le'olam, before the world. Now, that's alluded to in the very first letter of the Torah, as we know. Right? The Torah is written with the letter Beis. And Beis, in addition to the fact that it's the second letter of the alphabet, Beis stands for Bria, creation. So the story of creation is the second chapter or the second book in the story. What's Aleph? What's the first book? So there's a pasuk that says, Shlomo HaMelech says, A'alefcha chochma, A'alefcha bina. The word Aleph also means to teach. So A'alef, and remember, Shlomo HaMelech has a double expression. A'alefcha chochma, I will teach you wisdom. A'alefcha bina, I will teach you understanding. Two Alephs, right? A'alefcha, the word A'alefcha, which is the word of Aleph, twice. That's what it means. Alpayim shana kadma Torah la'olam. It's not a time thing. that 2,000 years before the world there was already Torah, because there was no time at that point. Right? We are taught that time is a creation. Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Boiker, only begins, the concept of evening and morning, and Yom Echad, the measurement of a day, only begins when the physical creation starts. So how could you have 2,000 years before time? That makes sense. So what does it mean, Alefcha Chochma, Alefcha Bina, or Alpayim Shana Kodma, that the Torah preceded the world by 2,000 years? It means that there are two major degrees of intellect that are within Torah beyond the intellect of Torah that creates the world. Okay? So let's put it this way. It's often easiest to use a mashal, right, to explain these things. So let's talk about it this way. Let's imagine for a moment that there's somebody who's a brilliant mind, and because they're a brilliant mind, they're able to achieve something absolutely brilliant. It could be in the sciences, could be in the arts, could be in technology. So let's use the technology example, okay? Let's say that the person who writes the code that runs our cell phone. Yeah? You ever met this person? No? So the person who writes the code that runs the software that runs our cell phones. Now, imagine you meet this person and you say, "It's wonderful to meet you. You are the most amazing cell phone I've ever met." Besides if it would be completely ridiculous, it would be insulting. What do you mean? They're not a cell phone. They're not even a creator of the apps that run the cell phone. That's what they do. That's not who they are. So we always have to distinguish between the production, the producer, and all the other elements about the person outside of that particular role of being the producer. That makes sense? So in other words, if you had to meet this person, let's say for argument's sake, that there was somebody who was about to date this person, right, to make a shidduch between the app programmer and somebody who's, whatever, an app user, right? So we put that together and we say, can you imagine if the entire relationship was just based on the writing of the code for that series of softwares that run the different kinds of... Imagine that was the relationship. What kind of a relationship would that be? You have to recognize there's more to the person. And not only is there more to the person, sometimes there's exponentially more to the person than the achievement that we're aware of. So that's what happens to us. We look around at the world, we go out into nature, we go to Vic Falls, and we say, "Oh, there's a God. There's a God. I can see it, I can feel it, absolutely." Why? Because that waterfall is so impressive to me, there must be an amazing God. And it's true. Creation is an indication of the fact that there's a God, there has to be a creator, and an amazing creator. But if we were to turn around to Hashem, let's say on Rosh Hashanah now, and say, "Hashem, you are great because you created Vic Falls," that should be insulting. Not only that, but if we were to say that the Torah is great because it's the blueprint of the world, not only that Hashem is great, the Torah, if we said that the Torah is great because it's the blueprint of the world, it's insulting. Torah is way beyond that.
I used to tell my children, you're not a walking brain.
Right. But this is beyond, right? Correct.
Brain. I don't
Correct.
think you didn't pass the test.
Correct. So here's the thing. If we think that Torah is just the experience that we have of Torah within the world, we haven't scratched the surface.
The instruction.
Even if you had to see it as the instruction for the world, we haven't scratched the surface. And we have a really good example of this, by the way.
But that's a big thing for Kira, though.
Okay, that's maybe a separate conversation, and we can debate that. Right? We can debate if perhaps we're selling ourselves short. Right? By saying to people that Torah is something that will appeal to their sensibilities, we might be selling ourselves short.
Isn't Torah Hashem talking to us?
Well, there's an element of Torah that is Hashem talking to us. It's not the same as saying that is Torah. We've got to be clear about that. I'll explain what I mean. Here's an example. In Tehillim 119, David HaMelech says, he calls the Torah, Zemiros hayulu chukecha. That your statutes were for me like Zemiros, like songs. In the same way as a person will enjoy the beauty of a song, and it will move them, and it will stimulate their neshama. So he was saying the same kind of thing about Torah. The Gemara tells us that David was punished for that. David Zemiros Koris Lahu. He called the Torah Zemiros, and as a result of that, he was punished.
Could it be that it's Hashem's spirit?
We'll talk about that later. But it's beyond that. So, what does it mean that David was punished for calling the Torah Zemiros? It means that David was talking about the greatness of Torah in its relationship to our world and to us, and basing the greatness of the Torah on our experience. And remember, David HaMelech was not like the rest of us. David HaMelech was a very elevated soul with a tremendous insight into Torah. Remember that the Gemara tells us the uniqueness of David HaMelech is that whenever he studied a piece of Torah, he always figured it out appropriately according to how the halacha should be applied, to the extent that the rest of the Sanhedrin always had to concur with him because his insight was so absolutely crystal clear. And yet, when he referred to the Torah as something which is the cause of pleasure to a human, he was censured for that. Because it's not.
Could we not say that the world was created with Hashem's wisdom?
That's part of the problem, right? That's part of the problem. To say that the world was created with Hashem's wisdom is very different from saying Hashem's wisdom is there to create the world. Very different. In other words, let's use another example. Let's use the example of the kid who has to introduce, that at school sometimes in grade 1 they have those bring your parents to school days. And then the parent has to say what they do, and the child's like all excited, my father is a whatever. Yeah, right? So imagine it's one of those days, and this kid brings the father to school, and the father is a professor of mathematics, applied mathematics at Harvard. And now this little child who's 6, 7 years old has to introduce the father and tell everybody, tell your class what your father does. So the child gets up and says, my father is a professor of mathematics, and he's so brilliant that when I bring home my homework, he doesn't even have to use his fingers. So it's cute. It's cute. And we'd accept it because it's cute. Now imagine if the following week the same person has to get up and address this massive hall filled with mathematicians, and the MC who gets up to introduce them says, welcome everybody, Professor whatever the name is, who is so talented that he doesn't even have to use his fingers for his son's grade 1 maths. It's not cute anymore. Right? In the same way, if we're going to say that in our perception, our experience of Hashem, what makes Hashem, so to speak, relatable for us is the brilliance of his creation. Well, that's where we see his wisdom, that's where we see his greatness. That's cute.
So it's not
But
what
if
he does, it's who he is.
correct. But if David HaMelech gets up, David HaMelech is not in grade 1. And David HaMelech says that Torah is our, so to speak, benefit. It's based on what it does for us. That's not acceptable. Torah is way beyond what we can absorb, understand, appreciate, define, etc. So that's the reason why the 10 Commandments are not on the list. We're only going to speak about things in this Perek that are things part of the created reality. The Aseret HaDibros, out of the whole of Torah, the Aseret HaDibros, the 10 Commandments, that's the part that Hashem spoke to us. That's the essence of Torah. Not that one part of Torah is more important than another part, but that's the part of Torah where Hashem expressed himself to us rather than just instructed us. That's beyond this conversation. As much as we're going to learn in this Perek, we need to know that there's a huge amount that is beyond this chapter as well. And that's the introduction. So it's interesting. The introduction is by omission. by what's not being said. And with that in mind, we can then break it down into the three different numbers that are used in this chapter. So, we've got the number 10, we've got the number 7, and we've got the number 4. Before we can begin this chapter, if we're going to pay so much attention to these numbers, then surely we have to understand what they represent, number 1, and number 2, how each of these numbers is relevant to the overarching theme of Pirkei Avos, which is to go beyond the requirements, milid chasidusa, beyond what is expected or even mandated by the Torah. So let's start with the number 10.
Which chapter?
Chapter 5. Starting chapter 5. We haven't started the Mishnah yet. This is all preamble. So the significance of the number 10.
So before you carry on, why is it so important to go and wax lyrical so much about this point? It's like an obvious point.
Which point?
This whole point that you've been speaking about.
That Torah is completely beyond. No, the fact that Hashem is much more is...
Hashem is much more.
But Torah...
So why even have to mention that?
Okay, good question. But remember, we're talking over here about the greatness of Torah as opposed to the greatness of Hashem. The greatness of Hashem should be quite obvious. The greatness of Torah is not always so obvious to people, unfortunately. And what happens to us is we very often believe that, let's say for argument's sake, we study a particular part of Torah. It could be a parasha in Chumash, it could be a Gemara, it could be whatever it is. Let's say that we study it again and again and again and again and again and review and find every commentary on it and listen to every available shir. We might at some point say, well, that part of Torah, I think I've got like 80%. And this teaching says that when you're dealing with an infinite scale, it doesn't matter how much you've learned, you haven't scratched the surface. Now that's very important for the principle we're going to learn about now, which is the milid chasidusa. Why is there a need to go beyond the letter of the law? Surely the letter of the law says this is what you got to do. That's what you got to do. What's so difficult about it? Why are we looking to invent? What are we inviting Torahs? The Torah says do this. What are you got to be a meshugah now? I think I told you once, right? What's the definition of meshugah from? What's meshugah from? Anybody? What's the definition of meshugah from? Anybody's more from than me? You're more from than me, you're meshugah. If you're less from me than me, you're barely Jewish. That's kind of how we look at it, right? So why do I have to be meshugah? The Torah says that's what you got to do. That's what you got to do. So in order to motivate for the concept of this milid chasidusa, lifnei mishuras hadin, going beyond the requirement of the law, we need to understand that whatever we do within the requirement of the law limits us to our own resources, and our own resources are trapped within the surface experience of Judaism. When we push ourselves beyond our resources, that's what opens up the possibility of something that's beyond the surface. And it's part of what we're going to look at now. Okay, so the number 10. What's the significance of the number 10? Yes, there are various things. This is not the same question. It's saying, how many things could we come up with that are associated with the number 10? That's not the question. I mean, it's a fun game to play on a long Shabbos afternoon. But what's the significance of the number 10? Why is 10 a central number in Judaism? Why is it shlemus? Now, it's interesting you say that, right? So, fortunately for us, some of us at least in the room, fortunately we grew up with a metric system, right? Some people here may recall the time before the metric system, right? It doesn't make any logical sense. How many feet in a yard and how many yards in a mile? Just make it metric. That's why we say shlemus, right? Because when things are in a metric system, they're very easy to firstly calculate, they're very easy to determine when you've reached a point of completion. So for us in Judaism, the number 10 is always associated with the completion of a system. And if you take the number 10 and you multiply that by 10, that would obviously be the ultimate completion of a system. So the number 100 is a number that always represents the ultimate completion of a system. Like, for example, 100 brachas in a day. It's not just because we're trying to tally up how many brachas. Long before discovery started with steps, right? We were already doing this, counting how many brachas we said in the day. You should get an app for that, right? That counts how many brachas you say. But it's not just about saying 100 brachas. It's the concept of shlemus, right? This completion, this holistic experience of acknowledging Hashem consistently through the day. And that's why when a person is in Tanakh, if a person is referred to as being 100 years old, that always has significance beyond their age. So the thing that happens when Abraham has a son at 100 years old, it's not just, oh, great miracle because an old man had a child. It's a shleimus. He had reached a state of spiritual, holistic connection, and therefore the kind of child that he had was a completely different child to any other child that had ever been born in history up until that point, etc. So yes, the number 10 is a number of shleimus, of completion, and the question is why? Besides the simplicity of using a metric system, what's relevant about the number 10? What does 10 represent? Where does 10 come from? Why is that the number? Because you know what the funny thing is? The funny thing is that being part of Hashem's creation, we are incapable of seeing an alternative creation. So there's so many things that we say because that's the way it is. And we forget that Hashem is infinite and he could have created it in any other way that he had chosen. If Hashem had theoretically chosen that 13 should be the number of shleimus, in our reality it would be the most whole number that exists. So it's not good enough for us just to look at the end product and say, yeah, well, 10 is a whole number. We need to ask, why did Hashem choose that number? What's the backstory? What's the significance of the number 10? So we'll say 10 commandments, right? We'll say 10 utterances. Doesn't answer the question. Why 10? What's going on behind the scenes? What's the relevance of the number 10? And ends in a 0. Okay, so you're right. It starts with a 1, and 1 is obviously a significant number. Okay, so does 12, so does 15. So what's the significance of 10? What are you going to say?
It's made up of little something which is.
And any compound number will be made up of units, right?
There's something deeper which is.
Okay, so what's deeper?
Building up to the 10.
So what's deeper? No, what's 10? It can't be infinity. It's a calculator total. It can't be infinity.
No, it's not.
So what's the significance behind the number 10? Oh, I'm glad you said it. I'm going to come back to Hashem's name. So the significance of the number 10 is that throughout all Jewish mystical sources, we talk about the fact that there are 10 spheros. That means that the entire system that Hashem uses for creation, not just here in this world, where the metric system is convenient, but the entire system of creation from the very first being, which, by the way, is not a creature. The very first being is not an angel. The very first being is a concept. Because Hashem is infinite. That means there are no concepts. Each concept is finite. So the very first being that exists is some kind of an abstract spiritual concept. Right from that very first launch of any kind of existence, the template that Hashem uses is 10 sephiros. Now those 10 sephiros exist in multiple ways in different dimensions, but they'll always have similar characteristics. Now if that sounds really abstract, let's make it a little bit more tangible, okay, for a second. The concept of love, which is one of the 10 sephiros, the concept of love exists in multiple ways in different dimensions. For example, is it acceptable in the 21st century? Because you've got to be careful, right? In today's world, most things are no longer acceptable. So in today's world, is it acceptable for a person to say, I love coffee? Is that acceptable? Would it be fair to say that that represents an emotion that belongs to the world of love? In other words, does a person love coffee? Yes. Does that mean that they're going to buy gifts for the coffee? No. So what does that tell you? That the concept of love exists with a very similar definition, but completely differently in different dimensions. So in the dimension of things that we love because they add value to our lives or because they make us feel good, that's one dimension of love, like loving coffee. A completely different dimension of love is the love that a parent has for a child. Totally different. But we can still use the same word because fundamentally it's the same attribute. How is it the same attribute? What is the similarity between loving coffee and loving one's child? What's the similarity? Right? Seriously. How can we use the same word? So what is the feeling? What's the feeling? Because you don't get nachas from your coffee.
Exactly.
You might enjoy your coffee.
Incorrectly, I think
we could be very purist and say we should have another word, right? We should have another word for coffee that's not the same word as for our children, so that they don't get mixed messages. Say, now hang on, which one do you love more? But it is still fair. It's fair to have the same expression. It's fair. We know that in every language, and English is maybe not the best language for subtlety, right? Hebrew is a far more subtle language. But even in any language, there will always be overlap about how we use certain words in different contexts. I'll give you another example, right? We're going to speak about the fact that on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem is going to judge the tzaddik. And if you are a tzaddik, you're going to get brachas for the next year, right? We all acknowledge that if we make it through the next year, we can't now call ourselves a tzaddik and tell everybody that they should come to us for advice. We understand that the word tzaddik is a sliding scale. It depends on the context. When you're talking about Rosh Hashanah, tzaddik means you are considered in the good books. When we're talking about the analysis of who should be the spiritual leaders of the community, tzaddik means something else. So it's possible. We can use the same vocabulary, but understand that in different contexts it means different things. So what is common between love of coffee and love of our children?
It's an emotional.
It is emotion. I wouldn't say coffee is emotional.
No.
Right? It may be impulsive. It's possibly even lustful, right? But it's not a real meaningful emotion. So what's the correlation? What's the similarity between them?
It's a pleasure.
Okay, and children are not always a pleasure,
No.
right?
It can be better.
In other words, there's no occasion in a person's life where they put their coffee down quietly in another room and go out and turn off the lights and then they have pleasure from their coffee. But that can happen with your children. So what's the commonality between the love of coffee and the love of our children? How can we use the same word? When we love something or someone, it causes us to feel good and to
Appreciate.
connect. If we love something, what we're effectively saying is we want to be with it. If we love coffee, that means we would love to have a coffee in our hand. We don't love coffee that we have a collection of coffee beans. That's not what it means when we love coffee. If we love coffee, that means we want to have a coffee in our hands because we love the sensation and the taste and the rush, or whatever it is. Love means, in its most, so to speak, scientific sense, whatever propels us towards something or someone. And then you can say there's mature love and there's immature love. There's self-interested love and there's altruistic love. And that's where you get the spectrum. But what's fundamentally common to all love is that love is the dynamic that pushes us towards something or wants us to bring it into our lives. Passion is a subcategory of love. Exactly. Okay? Let's use another example just for comparison's sake. So what's the balance of love? If anybody here is familiar, and I imagine some of you are, with the spheroids. So what's considered the balance of love? You've got love on the one hand. What's the balance of love is? Before we use a Hebrew word, let's just not hate. It's interesting. What's Elie Wiesel's famous line? It is indifference, right? Elie Wiesel says the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. But we're looking for something that's positive. The opposite of, that's why I didn't use the word opposite. The balance of one kind of experience will be another positive experience that's different. So if love is what pulls us towards,
Then disconnection.
correct. So then the opposite or the balance of that is the ability to pull away. What do we call it in simple psycho-evolutionary terms? Fight or flight. Fight means I love the engagement, so I'm willing to go and fight and overcome. Flight means I'd rather not get involved. So it's the opposite, it's pulling away. So in the same way as love means what pulls a person towards something, fear is what pulls a person away from something. And in the same way as you can have mature and immature love, there's mature and immature fear. So fear of the dentist might be very common, but it's not a very developed kind of fear. It's not because we've worked on ourselves for many years and we've eventually reached the point where we're scared to go to the dentist, right? Whereas fear of God, and there the word fear is misrepresented, unfortunately, because it sounds so negative. But fear of God is actually a very mature place to be, because it's the part of us that ensures we stay away from anything that might interrupt our relationship with Him. So those are what we call the 10 spheros, or at least part of the 10 spheros. And in different realities, those 10 spheros will manifest as more abstract and more subtle and more spiritual, or more tangible, depending on where we are. That's why the number 10 is such a significant number, because the internal framework of every structure within existence will have these 10 components, starting from the 10 spheros as they are in their most pristine form, translating into the fact that we're told there are 10 facets to the soul, what's called the 10 koichos hanefesh, which are some of what we've spoken about now. They play out in certain behaviors or characteristics or emotions, all the way down into a much lower version of a toxic set of 10 behaviors, which is the unhealthy traits and characteristics that sometimes even represent entire archetypes or even nations in the Torah. So now here's the thing about this number 10. It's a structure, it's a healthy structure that Hashem has created. And in order for a healthy structure to exist, the first thing that you have to know is who you are in the structure. So if a person is the CEO of the company, many years ago I met a guy, he wrote a book called The E-Myth. It's a Jewish guy, very successful book. And the premise of his book is that all entrepreneurs eventually reach a point where they are the greatest danger to their business. Because when you start up a business from the ground, you've got to do everything yourself. When the business is now burgeoning and growing, the worst thing to do is do everything by yourself. So if you don't know where you belong in the structure is going to collapse, or the structure will be dysfunctional. So the first thing of all growth and development is, because Hashem has created a structural world that we live in that has these 10 epicenters of energy and structure, we need to identify where we belong in all of that. So we have certain archetypes in Torah, like we'll use Abraham and Yitzchak as two archetypes, probably the most famous. So Abraham would be an archetype of what? Of chesed, otherwise known as love. Abraham is the archetype of love. And Yitzchak is the archetype of Gevurah, or fear of Hashem. That's why when Yaakov later on refers to his father, it's the only time in the entire Tanakh that somebody does this. He says, Elokei avi Avraham, the God of my father Avraham, upachad Yitzchak. And the way he describes Hashem in the relationship between Yitzchak and Hashem is pachad, fear. It's fascinating, right? But that's the point. Yitzchak is an archetype of the Gevurah, which is the fear-based or retraction-based way to serve Hashem. Now they have to know their way, and they have to know their place in the structure. If Abraham decided one day, can you imagine this? Imagine one day Abraham decided, I don't want to do this hospitality thing anymore. Takes up too much time, takes up too much energy. I'd much rather go hide in a tent somewhere and learn Torah for the rest of my life. It would be completely inappropriate, because that's not his place in the structure. And likewise, if Yitzchak had decided that he was going to go travel around the world telling everybody about God because that's what his father did, that would be completely inappropriate. Yitzchak was never allowed to leave the borders of Israel, because his world is, you pull back from the world in order to have an intensity of connection to Hashem. So you had to know his part in the structure.
Could it be fair to say that Esau didn't know his place in the world?
Esau, like any of the other negative archetypes in the Torah, is a toxic version of what, in this case, was his father's energy.
Chesed.
No, his father's energy. Esau is toxic Gevurah. Okay, but that's subject for another conversation. It's going to be it's a great topic, just beyond today's topic. So you need to know where you belong in the structure, because if you don't know where you belong in the structure can't work. Like in any other scenario. There's a very famous story about a wealthy man who used to traveled extensively on business, and he had a Jewish wagon driver, right? The original Uber driver. He was a Jewish Uber driver. And they used to travel around together. And whenever he'd arrive at a town before Shabbos, this wealthy man would go and in those days, the mikveh was also the communal bathhouse. So he'd go to the mikveh and he'd prepare himself for Shabbos. And then once he was ready for Shabbos, he'd go to the shul, like a half an hour before shul started, and he would sit there and he would read Shir HaShirim, as some have the custom to do. And then as the poor people would file into shul, he'd invite them all over to his hotel, and he'd have an elaborate dinner for all of the poor people of the town wherever he landed up. While this was going on, the wagon driver would be obviously finding a place to hitch the horses, and he'd be feeding the horses, and then he'd be a guest at the table. So on one particular occasion, they're traveling to a shtetl, and the wagon driver says to the wealthy man, he says, "Would you mind? I just have this incredible desire to be the host of a Shabbos meal with a whole lot of poor people. Would you mind if just once we switched places? Just once." So the balabos says to him, "Okay, no problem. Before we pull into town, we'll find a quiet spot. We'll switch clothes. I'll put on the wagon driver clothes. You put on my fancy suit. And we'll go to town. You do my stuff. I'll do yours." Great. So they pull into the town. And the rich guy now has to go and find a barn and hitch the horses and feed them and clean them, do whatever. He has no clue what he's doing. He falls multiple times. He doesn't know how to navigate his way through the mud of the stable, whatever the case is. By the time he's finished with all this, the horses haven't really eaten properly. He's muddy top to toe, rushes to the mikveh at the last minute just before Shabbos comes in, out quickly, doesn't have a time properly to clean up properly. Gets to shul, he's late for shul, he's never been late for shul in his life. Sits at the back, is embarrassed of how he looks because he's filthy. Meantime, the other guy comes in over there, he has no idea how to say Shir HaShirim. He has no idea what he's doing. He starts inviting all of the poor people over. They come to his hotel. He doesn't know how to run a Shabbos table with those kinds of guests. He doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know which zmiros to sing, he doesn't know what vort to say, he doesn't know, the people feel uncomfortable. The whole thing's a mess from top to bottom. It's a complete mess. So the story goes that not long after that, these two fellows passed away, and the neshamas come upstairs, and they've been both decent people, but in the heavenly courts, they say there's one Shabbos that went completely wrong. You both have to go back to fix that Shabbos, because that Shabbos went so wrong. And that's the story. The name of that story is called the story of the Neshamois HaToyos, the wandering souls, where you land up in the wrong place. So if you don't know where you belong in the structure, then the structure can't work. And the key to the entire structure of all of existence is 10. That's why the Mishnah is going to talk about the number 10. But what we will discover very soon in the chapter is that many of the things we discuss with regards to the number 10 don't seem to adhere to the structure. We're going to talk about miracles. We're going to talk about things that were created on Friday afternoon at twilight that are nishtahin unishtaher, as we say. They're not red, they're physical things, but they don't behave according to the rules of nature. Why is that? And the reason is because Pirkei Avos is telling us how to go beyond the structure. How to go beyond. Yes, we have to identify where we belong in the structure. Equally, we have to ensure that we're not trapped by the structure. The person who says, "Well, what do you want from me? I'm a chesed person. I can't be disciplined. It's just not my nature. Can't have that ability to pull back and self-regulate. It's just not me. I'm a giving person." Or vice versa. The person says, "I'm an introvert. What do you want from me? I can't be a chesed person. Can't go and share love and so on. I'm a gevura person."
So we want the blend.
So we need to learn. Even Tiferes could be part of the system. Even though you're right, Tiferes is the blend, but Tiferes is also part of the system. So the challenge is to learn how to live in where we belong within the structure and also step out of it when appropriate. That's the first series of teachings in this chapter. And then, please God, next time we'll look at what the significance of the numbers 7 and 4 are. And once we've done that introduction, then we can actually dive in to the perek itself. So, to be continued.
Can I give you
They
a
recommend.